This UEFN tutorial will cover the process of loading custom instrument samples into the Patchwork Instrument Player. The tutorial will show the process, but assumes some basic experience in working with UEFN, the Patchwork patching system, and also editing a UEFN experience in the creative mode. Some experience using music software samplers like those in Ableton Live Sampler and Native Instruments Contact would be really helpful background. There are lots of tutorials online to catch up on some of that experience before coming to this particular tutorial. The learner outcomes will be able to build a simple instrument player to use in Patchwork. We'll be able to import instrument samples properly prepared for the instrument player, and you'll be able to build a fusion patch to assign to an instrument player. So let's get started. Okay, before we go into the tutorial on how to load our own sounds into a Patchwork instrument player, I wanted to give a quick demo of having 3 instrument players loaded with 3 different sample banks to create a quick music demo. So in the back we have a rhythm section, we have a chord progression here in the middle, and our melody up front. We are using the Patchwork Music Manager device to pick our key mode, and tempo. And that information is given to any device that can take advantage of it. It's given to it globally. Okay, let's start with the middle section where our chord progression is here. I'll bring up the gain on this so we can listen to it. And this is being voiced by Mellotron samples that I've loaded into this Patchwork instrument player. Here with a note sequencer, we see a minor 7th chord that is being progressed with this note progressor through the chord progression that I wanted to use. I am using a filter effect set to bandpass so that I can position these sounds in the lower mid-range of the audio spectrum, and an echo effect before a gain effect here at the end. This gives us the ability to control how loud this voice will be relative to the other 2 parts. Okay, in the background here I have a rhythm section, and this is being voiced by Lindrum samples. Now we have the same note sequencer as before, but it's configured a little differently to take advantage of the drum samples in this instrument player. Some distortion, echo, and another gain control. Okay, up front we have our melody. And this melody is being voiced by plate bell samples loaded into this instrument player. The melody progression is being created here with the note sequencer and the note progressor. Another filter effect set to high pass so that these voices will be pushed into the upper mid range of the audio spectrum. Some echo, and again, some gain control. So now that we've gone through a quick demonstration of using instrument banks together, we will go through the process very carefully of loading our own samples into a Patchwork instrument player. Okay, now we'll start the process of loading our own instrument samples into an instrument player. In order to do that, I'm going to lay out the basic devices that we need in the UEFN editor. And then after we've done that, we'll flip over to the Fortnite creative mode so we can interact with the device's user interface and save the patch content back in the UEFN editor as well as the Fortnite creative mode as needed. So in order to build the basic patch, we're going to need to access the Fortnite devices available in the Fortnite content under Devices, Audio, and Patchwork devices. And here we're going to see a list of a wide range of devices that we could use, but for now we're going to simply stick with the Patchwork Music Manager, followed by the Patchwork Note Sequencer. And this one can take a little while to load, so I'm going to be patient while this one loads into the editor interface. Okay, and then we're going to use the Patchwork Instrument Player, of course, and we're going to need a speaker for the final output. Now we could change several parameters of these devices here in UEFN, but we're going to primarily do most of that work in the Fortnite Creator mode so we can see all of the user interface options using the Patchwork tool. So I'm going to position these a little farther away from our spawn points. And now we will start a Fortnite Creator session by clicking on the Launch Session button here. I am not auto-starting the game. I've turned this option off. I find this more helpful with this particular workflow because we're going to be wanting to jump back and forth between UEFN and Fortnite Creative and save our content as we go. And it's going to be much easier to do that if we have this particular feature turned off. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the session now, and we'll jump over to Fortnite Creative. Okay, now that we're in Fortnite Creative mode, we can start making our patch connections and test out the basic sounds that we might hear. So in order to make our patch, we are going to need to connect these three devices. We're not going to connect the music manager. That is a global device, and so that signal is sent without an actual patch cable. We are going to access the Patchwork tool. You can see in my inventory, so I'll access that now and drag and make this connection between these two devices. Okay, so we're going to patch that source to this destination. And of course, we're going to patch this source to this destination here. Okay. Now I like to expand the panels so we can see all of the available parameters. I'm expanding these until I don't see an up arrow anymore. I know that all of the possible parameters are exposed in the interface when that arrow is cleared out. And so now we see all of the possible user interface tools that are available in each of the devices. We're not going to be working with the time signature. I know that ahead of time. I'm going to leave that at 4.4. So I will reduce the size of that particular panel. Now, if I wanted to make a change to tempo, of course, I could use the Patchwork tool to do that. I find that a little bit difficult to click and drag and change this and get a very precise number. So it might be easier to press the E key and directly edit these parameters in this interface here. So I'd like to go ahead and just type in this tempo directly so I don't have to worry about finding the precise position using the Patchwork tool. And we could change these other parameters as well as we went along. But I do want to see major key mode, and we should be in good shape for the music manager settings at this point. Now, before we get further into the patch, I would like to point out that if I do navigate back to my editor and I highlight the music manager, we're going to see the same changes that we made in Fortnite Creative reflected here. Because this session is connected, we see these same parameters updated as we make them in either here or in UEFN. And so I recommend getting used to the process of moving back and forth between these two interfaces as needed when we're doing patchwork patching. This change that I made is not saved until I save the content here in the editor. By saving it here, that saves the level that I'm working on, that saves all the parameters for the devices that I've changed, and all of the note sequences or patch connections that I've made in the Fortnite Creative mode. So we'll need to get used to, and I recommend spending some time getting used to going back and forth between these two interfaces. Now, by default, the instrument player starts with the piano instrument. So I could type in here or program in, fill in, punch in a C major scale to the sequence. And of course, we hear that reflected in the instrument player, outputting that to the speaker. So that's all seeming to be working perfectly well. I will point out the vibrato tool here. maybe piano isn't the best choice for a vibrato, so I'm going to pick a different instrument. And I could adjust the vibrato, and I'm pointing that out because I think it's something that you folks might want to work with in your custom patches. And so learning to work and listen for that change is important. Now, it might not be that clear to hear vibrato until we have the sustained note. So I'm going to erase these notes. I'm going to start over here really quickly by clicking and dragging the C note for a longer duration. So I'm sustaining that note over 7 positions, and then we would hear clearly this vibrato setting. So that's something you may want to work with your own custom patches. Let's have a closer look at the note sequencer device. I'm not going to describe all of the parameters available in this device. I'm only going to point out the ones that I think are important as we start loading up our custom samples into the instrument sample player. So the first thing we look at is the step rate. That's going to describe the 8 columns that we have here, and with a step rate of eighth notes, this would describe the length of our sequence as 1 bar. So we can increase that to 2 bars if we need to. We can also change the step rate resolution. We can change the height and within our limit of the number of notes that we see available in the interface. But you may notice that these are only displaying notes of the C major scale. And that's because that is the setting in our music manager. So this sequencer, by default, has quantized the grid to only show notes that are available in the particular key that is selected. This is a feature we can turn off if we want to. So let's go into the editing mode of working with this device, and we can find this particular setting for making all of the notes chromatic. By setting this to chromatic, all of the possible 12 notes available would be displayed and able to be programmed into the interface. Or we can leave it on so that we only can program in or type in notes of the C major scale. I do want to change the sequencer to polyphonic. Because I want to make chords with the sequencer, I'm going to need to switch from monophonic on to monophonic off. By changing that setting, I can now create chords within the sequencer in a way I wasn't able to until I make this change. So now, with the piano voice, I could easily make a C major chord. By clicking and dragging my major triad across these grid units. Okay. So I think we're now ready to set up and start working with our own custom instruments in the instrument player. And I'm going to clear out this sequence so we're ready to start from scratch. Let's have a look at the samples that I'm going to bring into our instrument player. We have our drum sounds, our mellotron string sounds, and plate bell sounds. Now, these samples were recorded from one of the earliest samplers, which is tape-based. And you'll find this library out there recorded and made available free in several different places. You may have noticed that I have 2 different ways of cataloging these samples. They're the same samples, but in this case I have them cataloged or labeled as note name, and here they are labeled as note number. It's going to be much easier to use our Fusion patch tool for building our samples bank if we label our files by note number. It seems possible to use note names, but the current version of Unreal Editor for Fortnite had several problems in importing files, in particular those with the pound sign. This is a symbol for representing a sharp note, but that is unrecognizable or a illegal character when naming files in Unreal Editor for Fortnite. So when we import a file with this pound sign or sharp symbol, then that's going to change the label as it's laid out in the content folder, and will disrupt the ability to properly map this pitch. So I found it much easier to go ahead and go to the trouble of refiling these with note numbers. And in this case, we are correlating each of the samples to the proper MIDI note number to which the sample would correspond. So here we are, C3, that is a MIDI note number 60 in most cases of dealing with this type of information. So I have labeled the file _60.wave so that when I import it, the Fusion Patchwork tool will recognize this file and properly map the pitch to the sample player instrument. Now you can do this by hand labeling them. It can take a while, even with a relatively small sample bank like this is. It can still take a while to do that, but you will need a table to quickly reference which MIDI notes would correspond to whatever note name your library typically uses. Okay, now we're ready to import the actual samples that we're going to use in our instrument player. You can see that I already have drums, mellotron strings, and plate bells loaded and sampled in my audio folder inside my content. So there's my audio folder already made, and these instruments were already there being used in the demo earlier. I'm going to go ahead and start a new folder for importing these mellotron samples from scratch. And we'll open this up and import those files. So I'll click on the import button, and we're going to navigate to wherever these are on your Finder, and I'm going to bring these in all in one pass by selecting them all at once as I import them. Okay, we see the asterisk, meaning this import has not been saved. I will go ahead and save this content, saving those 35 files that I've entered. And I might come to the C3 and press play and hope that everything sounds as I would expect. Now, one of the guidelines for working with samples in the instrument player will be to make sure that they're uncompressed when we bring them into the game. So we need to change a setting for each of these assets. And I can double click on a setting, the wave file asset, and we want to change the compression type from platform specific to PCM. And PCM is what's called pulse code modulation. And by changing this to pulse code modulation, it will always be uncompressed. Okay, so we'll leave it like that. But what I really want to do is make that change to all of these assets at once. So I'm going to select all of the assets. I'm going to right click on any of them, and I'm going to go to Asset Actions. I'm going to go to Edit Selection and Property Matrix, and I'm going to change this to PCM. So I am now assigning this property to all of those assets in one pass, and I can save that for all 35 assets. Great, so that will save you time if you also need to do the same task. Okay, so now we're ready to build our Fusion patch. The Fusion patch is what's going to get loaded into the instrument player in place of one of the built-in sounds that are already there. So I, again, have all of my assets selected. I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to create a Fusion patch. Okay, we're going to use this same destination. I'll leave this patch right there in the same folder with my samples. I am going to change this name so that it's a little more appropriate for the patch as a whole. And I'm going to make sure that I'm assigning notes by note number. Remember, we spoke earlier about how doing it by note name is problematic. By doing it by note number, then we are able to properly map the files to the root note. So I want to make sure that my files, each sample is getting properly mapped to the appropriate root note. And the root note always is meant to correlate to or correspond to the original pitch that the instrument was sampled at with this particular file. So by having the root note properly matched, we know this pitch would always play back properly. If I get this mixed up or confused, you won't hear the proper pitch when I'm trying to play those instruments when I assign notes to them. So this is an important part of the step. Probably one of the most important parts of the whole process is making sure these are properly assigned. I found doing it by note number is efficient and seems to work well. We see a stretch between the first MIDI note 0 and 55, as we should for the lowest note. And we see a stretch of the last note from the highest note that we have sampled up to the highest available MIDI note number. So this looks good. I'm going to leave all the other settings as they were. I do have this ability to adjust octaves. I'm going to go ahead and leave it at 0 for if I'm working with a MIDI file. This is going to work great to leave it just that way. I import the MIDI file into another device available in Patchwork devices, and then the proper MIDI note would play the proper pitch that I would expect from my samples. However, when I'm working with the note sequencer, like I'm doing in my patch, reducing this by 2 octaves will make the middle C line up with a 3rd octave in the patch note sequencer. So I'm going to go ahead and do that here, and you would see that it offsets these numbers by whatever that value is, right? So that's supposed to be 55. I reduced this by 24 notes or 2 octaves. So we see that difference here reflected in these pitch values here. That means my MIDI file would not play properly, but it's going to sound right in the note sequencer if I'm using it this way. So not the greatest of solutions, but one that certainly works. You can work with it either way as you see fit. Okay, so that creates my Fusion patch, and this is what I can load into my instrument player. So I could go to my instrument player, and what I want to do, you see the piano is loaded by default, and what I would do typically is check this checkbox, and then I would go to this menu and find my Fusion patch. I will point out that if this is a brand new level, if you've created a brand new level for the first time, this list will not populate until you've saved the level. So if the level is saved properly, then you should find your sample, your Fusion patch of samples here. And now that's what the voice of this instrument is going to be. It's ready to go. So we do see vibrato here. You folks may remember I pointed out vibrato earlier. And if we do want vibrato to work, we do need to make an adjustment to the properties of the Fusion patch. So I've double-clicked on that to open that up. And we need to find LFO 1, and which is already assigned to pitch. And a vibrato is a vibration or a rise and fall in pitch that we typically manage through low-frequency oscillators or LFOs. And LFO1 is already assigned a pitch. So if we turn this on here, then that's great. The vibrato feature will work in the instrument player interface. We also see ADSR, or attack, decay, sustain, and release parameters. And you might find this helpful if you're familiar with working with ADSR envelopes to program a different dynamic shape of your sample. So this works well, and I see that feature being helpful in certain samples. Okay, so we're going to leave all the other settings as they are. I have made one adjustment to the LFO1. I've enabled LFO1, and I've left everything else as it is. Okay, by saving this change, our Fusion sampler patch is ready to go. Now, this Fusion sampler patch does not contain these samples. I need to keep these samples available. It is a reference to them. It uses these samples in addition to the parameters that I plug into or change here. Okay, so we've assigned it to the instrument, and that's all well and good. We think we're in great shape. However, if we did go straight to the Fortnite creative mode now, we would not hear this assignment. This information, this new data, this extra content that I'm creating and adding to my project is not loaded to the session in question, right? We only have the built-in modules loaded into the session. So what I need to do is push changes to this session now. So certain asset changes that you make are not going to be automatically updated to the Fortnite creative mode, but I will be required to push those changes so that they are downloaded back into that live session that I still have connected. Once we've done that, then the instrument player that's already in place should have these samples loaded. And so now we'll jump over, after this update is completed, we'll jump over to the creative mode, and we'll start to work with the patch and test to see if it's working properly. Now we're back in creative mode, and we're ready to listen to our Fusion patch loaded into the Patchwork Instrument Player. We no longer see the choice of flipping out between piano and other instruments that were built in. That has been changed when we turn on the custom switch and the parameters. I would like to put in some notes here in our sequencer so that we can hear if this has come across properly. So I guess the first thing I would typically do with working with any kind of pitch work like this or sample mapping is to make sure that it is in fact playing back these sounds in the proper pitch. So I typically do this by playing something like a C major scale. It's easy for me to hear the proper pitch. So I'm going to go ahead and program in a C major scale, and it sounds like it's already working. There we go. We've got a C major scale playing to our mellotron samples, and it seems like everything is working properly. So I'll clear that out. Now, remember I put a -2 offset on our octave, so that puts our instrument here in the middle as we would expect. So this will be, this particular slot will correlate to that first note that I played. But if I had not done that, I would need to be working up in here in the fifth octave instead in order to be playing the same pitches. So this will give me more range to use the sequencer properly by offsetting those instruments when I built this particular Fusion patch, knowing that this was going to be used with the note sequencer rather than with the MIDI sequencer. If I'm going to play a MIDI file back, then I'm going to need to probably keep those patches at their original pitch. Now we can create a chord, again, as we did before, by clicking and dragging. I can create my major triad here. And if I wanted that to be in my minor, of course, I can switch that here. And add that 7th note if I felt like that was a nice thing to do. And there we go. We have imported our custom samples for the Patchwork Instrument Player. And all I need to do is repeat this process for any other voices I want to bring in. Now, we can look at the memory that we've used using these particular samples, and we probably haven't been as efficient as we could have. These samples work pretty well as they are recorded. They're exactly how they would have been recorded off a mellotron. However, if I were working in a digital audio workstation, a lot of sample sets that you use today would have very large sustain values and very large files that would go with that. That's great for working in a digital audio workstation, not great for a platform like Fortnite. So we'd want to be very efficient with our file sizes and our samples. I would like to see sustain loops available in our patchwork system, our Fusion patchwork system, but I do not see that option at this particular time. If we had sustain loops available, and eventually I'm sure that we will, in a Fusion patchwork option, then we could make much more use of a smaller file size and create a sustained value, even though our actual sample could be quite shorter. So for now, this is just a demonstration of how to get the samples in. It'll be up to you to manage your sample sizes and be as efficient as possible. In conclusion, we were certainly able to build simple instrument player patches in Patchwork. We were able to import instrument samples and properly prepare those for use with the instrument player. And then we built a Fusion patch to assign to that instrument player. Some reflections that we might take away. The Fusion patch system is certainly a very powerful new tool for Patchwork. It opens up a lot of creative potential beyond what I've demonstrated here in the tutorial and even in the demonstration earlier in the video. We definitely had some difficulties using note names when importing audio samples. The workaround of using note numbers for audio sample naming conventions is certainly a good workaround. However, that could be difficult when it comes to large sample libraries. I certainly look forward to sustain loops in the Fusion patch setup in the future. I hope that a tool like that would become available so that we could get the most out of our sample libraries in a relatively small footprint that we upload to the Fortnite platform. I hope you've found this tutorial helpful. I sincerely look forward to more contributions to this community. I want to learn as much from your experiences working with Patchwork as possible, and I certainly look forward to more content available in these channels.